Sarah sat at the small, dusty bus station in the middle of nowhere, her hands clenched tightly around a crumpled letter she had received from Mark. She had been waiting there for hours as the sun beat down on the desolate town. The silence of the empty station made her heart ache with each passing moment. The only sounds were the occasional rustle of the dry wind through the trees and the distant hum of a car driving down the long road. It had been months since she last saw Mark, but she remembered that day like it was yesterday. He had kissed her goodbye with a promise that he would return soon, that he would come back to the town they had both known and loved. Mark had always been a man of his word, and Sarah believed in him with all her heart. That's why, even after so much time had passed, she stayed there, at the bus station, waiting for his return. Mark had been her best friend before anything else. They had grown up together in the small town, running through the fields and playing in the woods. As they got older, their friendship blossomed into something more. Mark was a cowboy at heart, always with a quick smile and a sense of adventure that drew Sarah in. He had been full of promises for their future. He talked about building a life together, starting a family, maybe even opening a small ranch. The thought of it made Sarah's heart race with excitement. But now, as the hours stretched into days, Sarah began to feel the weight of that promise slipping away. She had been standing at the bus stop waiting for Mark to return, but he still hadn't come. Each time a bus passed by, her heart leaped in her chest. Every bus that stopped only brought more strangers, people she didn't know, people who weren't him. She watched each one, hoping for a familiar face. But there was nothing, just unfamiliar eyes staring back at her. The townspeople had started to talk. "He's not coming back," they would say when they saw her standing at the station watching the horizon. Sarah tried to ignore their whispers, tried to convince herself that she just needed to wait a little longer, that Mark was out there, somewhere, on his way home. But the more she heard those words, "He's not coming back," the more they began to echo in her mind, and her hope began to fade. As the sun started to set, casting long shadows across the cracked pavement of the bus station, Sarah felt the weight of the world pressing down on her. The thought of Mark not returning was almost too much to bear. She could see his face in her mind, hear his laugh, feel the warmth of his hand in hers. They had shared so many memories, dreams for the future, and promises of what life would be like once they were together again. But now, it all felt like a distant dream. She took a deep breath and looked up at the sky, the clouds drifting lazily overhead. The town felt so empty, so quiet, and Sarah couldn't help but feel lost. The town, which had once felt full of life and love, now felt like a prison. The world outside seemed so big, and yet here she was, stuck in this tiny, forgotten place, waiting for something that might never come. It was like standing at the edge of a cliff, waiting for the storm to pass, but knowing deep down that the storm would never end. Sarah tried to remind herself of the promise Mark had made, that he would come back. But with each passing day, those words began to lose their power. Maybe it was the distance between them. Maybe it was the silence, but something inside her was starting to doubt. She couldn't shake the feeling that Mark had forgotten about her, that he had moved on to something else, somewhere else, and she was still here, clinging to the hope that he would return. She looked down at the letter again, the paper crinkling in her hands. It was the last one she had received from him, a letter sent just before his departure. The words were filled with love, with dreams for the future, but there was a strange tone to it that she hadn't noticed before. Mark had written that he would be gone for a while, but that he would come back to her. But there was something in the way he had written it, almost like he was saying goodbye, even though he wasn't saying the words. She had read the letter over and over, each time trying to find something that would tell her that Mark was coming home soon. But now, with each reading, the words seemed less certain, less hopeful. It was as if the letter had been a farewell in disguise. Tears stung Sarah's eyes as she remembered the last time she had seen Mark, the way he had held her hand, kissed her gently on the forehead, and whispered that he would be back soon. She had believed him with every fiber of her being, but now, as the days turned into weeks and the weeks turned into months, that belief was beginning to crumble. It was hard to keep believing in something when there was no proof, no sign that it would come true. The sky above her had turned a deep shade of orange as the sun began to set completely. Sarah stood up, wiping the tears from her eyes, and walked slowly toward the bench where she had been sitting. She sat down again, feeling the weight of the world settle on her shoulders. It was hard to know what to do next. Should she leave? Should she go back to her small house on the outskirts of town and try to move on with her life? Or should she stay as she had promised herself, waiting for Mark to return? The sound of an approaching car broke through her thoughts, and she turned to look. It was just another passing car, driving down the long, dusty road with no sign of anyone she knew. She sighed deeply, her shoulders slumping. Maybe it was time to face the truth. Maybe Mark wasn't coming back and she had to stop waiting for something that was never going to happen. But just as Sarah was about to stand up and leave, she heard the sound of footsteps behind her. Turning quickly, she saw the bus driver, Hank, standing a few feet away, watching her with a sympathetic expression. He was an older man, his face weathered by years of driving the bus through these dusty roads. Sarah had seen him come and go many times over the years, but today, his gaze was different. He looked at her as if he knew exactly what she was feeling. Hank took a step closer, and Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. She didn't know why, but she suddenly felt like something was about to change. Maybe it was just the sadness in his eyes, or maybe it was the quiet way he moved, like he had something important to say. "Sarah," he said softly, his voice gravelly from years of talking to passengers. "I've been driving this route for a long time, and I've seen a lot of people come and go. I've seen people wait for days, months, even years, hoping for someone to return. But sometimes people don't come back. And I think you need to face the truth." Sarah felt a lump form in her throat. She had heard these words from others before, but coming from Hank, they felt different. He wasn't just some stranger offering empty sympathy. He had seen so many people come and go, and his words carried weight. She opened her mouth to respond, but no words came out. Hank paused for a moment, as if giving her time to process his words. "I'm sorry, Sarah," he said gently, "but I don't think he's coming back. It's been too long and the road's been too quiet. Sometimes people change, and sometimes life doesn't go the way we expect it to." The words hit Sarah harder than she expected. She stared at the old bus driver, her heart sinking further. She had known, deep down, that Mark might not be coming back. But hearing it from someone else made it all feel so final, so real. Hank gave her a soft nod and walked away, leaving Sarah alone with her thoughts once again. She sat there in silence, feeling the weight of his words press down on her. Was it really time to stop waiting? Was Mark truly gone for good? The days after Hank's words passed in a blur. Sarah found herself trapped in a loop of disappointment and confusion. It was as though she couldn't break free from the weight of his statement. He's not coming back. No matter how hard she tried to shake it off, the words echoed in her mind, growing louder with every passing moment. Sarah had always prided herself on being strong, on holding on to hope when others might give up. But now, sitting in her small, quiet house, she felt something within her begin to crumble. The house, once filled with warmth and laughter when Mark had been around, now seemed cold and empty. Each room was a reminder of what was missing. His boots by the door, his jacket hanging on the back of a chair, the smell of his cologne still faintly lingering in the air. Everywhere she looked, she saw traces of him. It was early morning when Sarah decided to leave her house again. The sun had just started to rise, casting a soft golden glow over the town. The air was cool, and the sound of the wind rustling through the trees filled the quiet morning. As Sarah stepped outside, she took a deep breath, trying to fill her lungs with something more than just the emptiness she had been feeling. Maybe the fresh air would clear her mind. Maybe a change of scenery would help. She walked down the dusty road, her feet crunching on the gravel. She had spent so much time staring at the bus station, hoping for Mark to return, that she had forgotten how much the world outside had changed. It was a small town, but it felt so different now. Without Mark, everything seemed unfamiliar. The people who once greeted her with warm smiles now looked at her with pity, as if they knew something she didn't. As she walked, Sarah tried to push the thoughts of Mark out of her mind, but it was impossible. Every corner she turned, she saw something that reminded her of him. She passed the small cafe where they used to sit together, laughing over cups of coffee. She passed the old tree by the creek where they had shared their first kiss. It was all too much, and Sarah felt her chest tighten with grief. She had to stop for a moment to steady herself. There was a bench nearby under a tree, and she sat down, letting the cool air wash over her. She closed her eyes, trying to calm the storm inside her. But no matter how hard she tried to breathe through the pain, it felt like a weight pressing on her chest. Days turned into weeks, and the days felt like they were stretching out longer than they ever had before. Sarah still went to the bus station every day, though the hope in her heart was dimming with each passing hour. The buses that arrived seemed less and less likely to bring Mark, and the emptiness inside her grew heavier. The town was quiet, and there was nothing new to look forward to, nothing to take her mind off the ache that had settled deep in her bones. She tried to stay busy. She worked in her garden, pulling weeds and planting flowers that would never bloom the way they once had. She spent time at the local library, reading books she had never had the time to read before. But no matter how much she tried to distract herself, her mind kept drifting back to Mark. His absence was a constant ache, one that couldn't be soothed by anything. One evening, as the sun was setting and the sky painted itself in shades of pink and purple, Sarah sat alone in the living room staring out of the window. She had spent the entire day walking around the town, trying to push the thoughts of Mark away, but she couldn't escape them. She looked at the empty space where his boots used to be, where his jacket hung, where he used to sit at the kitchen table and talk about his day. Now everything felt so still, so quiet. The life she had known seemed like a distant memory, a dream that was slipping away. Sarah tried to convince herself that she needed to move on, that it was time to stop waiting. But even as she thought it, a small part of her refused to let go. What if he comes back tomorrow? That thought lingered in her mind, the last thread of hope she had. What if Mark was just delayed, lost somewhere, caught in something that kept him away longer than he had expected? It was possible, wasn't it? People got lost all the time, didn't they? The next day, Sarah decided to visit the place where she had first met Mark. It was the old barn at the edge of town, the place where they had spent countless hours talking, laughing, and dreaming about the future. It had been their spot, their secret place, and every time she visited, it felt like Mark was still there with her. She walked the familiar path to the barn, the dry grass crunching beneath her boots as she moved. The barn looked just as it always had, weathered, worn, but still standing strong. When Sarah reached the barn, she stopped for a moment, just standing there, breathing in the smell of the hay and the earth. It was quiet, peaceful, and for a brief moment she felt like everything was okay again. She stepped inside, her boots echoing on the wooden floor, and she sat down on the hay bales that were still scattered around the barn. The memories came rushing back. The sound of Mark's laugh, the way he had held her close as they sat together, dreaming about their future. They had spent so many hours in this very spot, talking about everything and nothing. They had made plans for their lives, plans that Sarah had believed in with all her heart. But now those plans felt like a distant dream, a dream that had shattered when Mark left without a word. Sitting there in the barn, Sarah felt a wave of grief wash over her. She missed Mark so much it hurt, and she wasn't sure how much longer she could keep waiting for him. The world had moved on, and here she was, still stuck in the past, holding on to a memory that was fading away. As she sat there, lost in her thoughts, the barn door creaked open, and Sarah looked up in surprise. She had not heard anyone approach. Standing in the doorway was an older woman from town, Mrs. Baker, who had lived in the area for as long as Sarah could remember. Mrs. Baker had always been kind to her, always with a warm smile and a gentle word. "I thought I might find you here," Mrs. Baker said, her voice soft but full of knowing. She stepped inside and sat down beside Sarah on the hay. There was a comfortable silence between them for a moment, and then Mrs. Baker spoke again. "You know, dear," she said quietly, "sometimes we wait for things that may never come back, and that's hard, I know. But there's also a time when we have to let go, not because we stop loving, but because we need to start living again." Sarah looked at Mrs. Baker, the tears threatening to fall once more. She felt the weight of those words sink deep into her heart. She didn't want to let go, not yet. But maybe Mrs. Baker was right. Maybe it was time to stop waiting. Sarah woke up to another quiet morning. The sun was still low in the sky, casting long shadows over the town. She had always loved mornings, but today it felt different. She no longer had the same excitement about a new day, the way she once did when she thought Mark would return. The energy was gone, replaced by a heavy sense of sadness that seemed to follow her wherever she went. Despite the weight in her heart, Sarah knew she couldn't keep running from the truth forever. The small town, the familiar roads, and the empty house, everything reminded her that Mark wasn't coming back. But she couldn't just sit around and let the days slip by. It wasn't who she was or who she had ever wanted to become. Sarah had always been strong. She was known for being independent, for pushing through even the toughest situations. But now she was struggling to find that strength again. She couldn't seem to find her way out of the fog of doubt and heartache. As she sipped her coffee, staring out the window, Sarah noticed something strange. There was a figure on horseback coming toward town. At first, she thought it was just another passerby, someone heading through on their way to somewhere else. But as the rider got closer, she felt a sense of recognition, though she couldn't place where she had seen him before. The cowboy on the horse was tall, with broad shoulders and a strong, confident posture. His face was mostly hidden under the brim of his wide hat, but there was something in the way he rode that caught Sarah's attention. He didn't seem in a hurry, as though he had all the time in the world. He moved with purpose, but there was an air of quiet mystery around him. As he rode closer to the bus station, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that he wasn't just a random traveler passing through. There was something about him, something that made her heart beat a little faster. The cowboy dismounted with a graceful, practiced movement, his boots hitting the ground softly. He looked around for a moment before his gaze landed on Sarah. For a brief second, their eyes locked. Something in that moment felt strange but comforting. He didn't speak, but Sarah could sense that he knew exactly who she was, even though they had never met before. There was no fear in his eyes, just a calm understanding. He walked toward her, his steps steady, and Sarah instinctively stood up. As the cowboy got closer, he tipped his hat slightly, a small gesture of respect. His face was weathered, like someone who had spent years riding under the sun, and his eyes had a depth that spoke of many untold stories. There was a quiet strength in him that seemed to fill the space around them. "I know what you've been waiting for," the cowboy said, his voice low but clear, carrying a sense of authority that immediately caught Sarah off guard. He spoke like someone who had seen the world, someone who understood more than most people ever would. "But it's time to stop waiting." Sarah's heart skipped a beat. How could he possibly know? She had never told anyone what she had been going through. Her struggle, her doubts, her pain, they were all private, locked away inside her. Yet here he was, saying exactly what she had been feeling for so long. It's time to stop waiting. The words felt like a punch to the stomach, but they also stirred something inside her, a feeling she couldn't quite explain. The cowboy stepped closer, just a few feet away now, and for a moment, there was a silence between them. It was the kind of silence that felt like it was filled with unspoken words. Sarah opened her mouth to ask who he was, to demand answers about how he knew so much, but the words never came. Instead, she just stood there, frozen in place, watching him. "I'm not here to tell you that it's over," the cowboy continued, his gaze steady. "I'm here to tell you that it's time to let go." The wind blew lightly through the trees, the only sound between them for a moment. Sarah felt the weight of his words pressing down on her chest. She wanted to argue, to fight against the reality that he was offering her, but a part of her knew that he was right. Deep down, she knew that she couldn't keep holding on to a hope that was slipping further and further away. Sarah took a step back, her mind racing. She felt like she had been living in a dream where Mark was still out there, just a bus ride away. But now the dream was starting to feel more like a fantasy, a lie she had told herself to keep from facing the truth. The cowboy watched her quietly, his expression unreadable. He didn't push her, didn't try to explain any further. He simply let her process the words he had spoken, allowing the silence to fill the space between them. For the first time in a long while, Sarah felt a sense of calm wash over her, though it was mixed with sadness. The cowboy wasn't telling her to forget Mark. He wasn't saying that everything she had felt for him was meaningless. He was simply telling her that it was time to stop waiting. Sarah closed her eyes for a moment, taking a deep breath. The thought of moving on, of letting go of the life she had imagined with Mark, felt impossible. She couldn't just forget him. She had loved him, truly loved him, and the thought of losing that love, of accepting that he might never return, was more than she could bear. But as the cowboy stood there, waiting for her to respond, she realized something. The waiting had been eating away at her for so long, and yet, it had only brought more pain. The hope she had been holding on to was like a chain that kept her tied to the past, to a time that no longer existed. Maybe it was time to stop waiting. Not because she didn't love Mark, but because she couldn't keep living in a place where he wasn't. Slowly, Sarah nodded, her heart heavy with the realization. The cowboy didn't say anything more. He simply tipped his hat once again, as if acknowledging her decision. And then, without another word, he turned and began to walk back toward his horse. "Remember," he called over his shoulder. "No more waiting." Sarah watched him walk away, her heart torn between grief and a strange sense of peace. As the cowboy mounted his horse and rode off into the distance, Sarah stood there for a long time, staring after him. She didn't know who he was or where he had come from, but somehow she knew that he had given her the final push she needed. She couldn't keep waiting for something that wasn't coming back. It was time to move on, even if it hurt. As the cowboy disappeared from sight, Sarah turned toward the bus station. The sun was higher in the sky now, casting a warm light over the town. For the first time in months, she felt like maybe, just maybe, she could begin to live again. It wasn't easy, and it wasn't going to happen overnight, but she knew that she had taken the first step toward healing. The days after the cowboy's visit felt different. Sarah could still hear his words in her mind like a soft whisper that wouldn't leave. No more waiting. It wasn't just a message from a stranger. It was a turning point, a signal that she needed to stop clinging to the past. She didn't fully understand why or how the cowboy had appeared in her life, but she knew that she couldn't ignore what he had said. As the days passed, Sarah slowly began to accept that it was time to let go. It wasn't easy, and there were still moments when she felt the ache of missing Mark. But with each passing day, that feeling began to fade a little more. She started to spend less time at the bus station, staring at the empty road, hoping to see a familiar face. Instead, she focused on the present, on the small steps she could take to move forward. Sarah decided to take a break from the town for a while. She needed a change of scenery, a way to clear her head and heal. It wasn't that she was running away, but she needed space to figure out who she was without Mark. She hadn't been just Sarah in so long. She had been Mark's girl, always waiting, always hoping. But now she needed to find herself again. So she packed a bag and decided to head to the nearby mountains, a place she had visited a few times when she was younger. The journey was peaceful, and the drive through the winding roads was calming. The further she got from town, the more she felt the weight lift from her shoulders. The mountains were beautiful this time of year, the trees lush and green, and the air fresh and crisp. It was exactly what she needed. Time alone, time to think, and time to heal. When Sarah arrived at the cabin in the mountains, she felt an instant sense of relief. The cabin was small, cozy, and surrounded by nature. It wasn't much, but it was enough. She unloaded her things and decided to take a long walk through the woods. The silence was soothing, and the sound of birds singing and leaves rustling in the wind was the only noise that accompanied her. As she walked, Sarah found herself thinking about all the things she had been holding on to, the memories of Mark, the dreams they had shared, the future they had planned. It felt like she had spent so much time looking forward to something that might never come to pass. But now, as she walked through the woods, she began to understand something. The life she had imagined with Mark wasn't the only life she could have. She could create her own path, her own future. It wouldn't be the same as what she had dreamed of with him, but it could still be beautiful in its own way. The more Sarah explored the area, the more she felt a sense of freedom. She was alone, yes, but it didn't feel like loneliness. It felt like an opportunity, a chance to build something new. There was no pressure, no expectation. It was just her, the mountains, and the fresh start she needed. The weight of the past, the uncertainty, and the fear that had held her back for so long began to dissolve. On the third day of her stay, Sarah decided to visit a nearby town to get supplies. As she walked through the small marketplace, she noticed a few people chatting in the square. It was a quiet place, nothing like the busier towns she was used to. Sarah felt a sense of peace here, something she hadn't felt in a long time. She took a deep breath, letting the fresh mountain air fill her lungs. While walking around, she bumped into an elderly woman who had a kind smile and a warmth about her that immediately put Sarah at ease. The woman's name was Mrs. Jenkins, and she owned a small shop filled with handmade crafts and local goods. She was friendly and had a way of making Sarah feel at home right away. "Are you new around here?" Mrs. Jenkins asked with a curious glance. Sarah nodded, smiling softly. I'm just visiting for a few days, she explained. I needed a change of scenery. I see, Mrs. Jenkins said, nodding. Well, this town has a way of healing people, if they're willing to listen to it. The words stuck with Sarah. Healing people? She asked. Mrs. Jenkins gave a knowing smile, as if she had heard the same thing many times before. This town is quiet, and sometimes that's all you need. No distractions, no noise. Just time to think and let the world slow down for a bit. Sarah thought about this as she wandered around the market, picking up a few handmade trinkets and some fresh fruit. There was something about Mrs. Jenkins's words that resonated with her. She had spent so much time waiting for something to change in her life, waiting for Mark to come back, that she hadn't realized how much time had passed. Maybe she had been too focused on the past and had missed the chance to live in the present. That evening, Sarah returned to the cabin, her arms full of supplies and her heart a little lighter. She made herself a simple dinner and sat on the porch, watching the sun set over the mountains. The sky turned shades of pink and orange, and, for the first time in a long time, Sarah felt a sense of peace. She didn't have all the answers, but she knew one thing for sure. She was finally ready to start living for herself again. As the days went by, Sarah spent more time in the mountains. She explored new trails, spent hours reading and writing in a journal, and simply enjoyed the solitude. She learned a lot about herself in those days. She realized that while she had always been strong, she had never truly allowed herself to grieve for the things she had lost. She had spent so much time holding on to the hope that Mark would come back that she hadn't given herself the chance to let go. By the time she was ready to leave the mountains and return to town, Sarah felt like a new person. She didn't have all the answers, and there were still days when the sadness crept in, but she had learned to embrace the uncertainty. She didn't need to know everything about the future. What mattered was that she was finally living for herself. The return to town was quiet. As Sarah drove back, she thought about everything she had learned during her time away. She wasn't sure what the future would hold, but she knew that she had a choice now. She could move forward not in spite of the past, but because of it. She was stronger for having gone through the pain, and she knew that she could face whatever came next with a sense of hope and courage. When Sarah returned home, the house didn't feel quite so empty anymore. It was still the same place, but it felt different. The quiet no longer felt suffocating. It felt like an invitation, a chance for her to fill the space with new memories and new dreams. And while she would always carry the love she had for Mark with her, she knew that it was time to create a future of her own. The past would always be a part of her, but it didn't have to define her. When Sarah returned to town, everything seemed quieter than before. The small, familiar roads that she had once walked with hope and expectation now felt different. There was a certain stillness about the place that seemed to reflect the changes she had gone through over the past few weeks. It was as if the town itself was waiting for her to come back, waiting for her to decide what came next. But unlike before, Sarah no longer felt like a prisoner of the past. She had been set free, not by someone else, but by her own decision to stop waiting. The house she had shared with Mark still looked the same. It was a small, cozy place with a little garden out front. It had been their home, a place where they had imagined their future together. But now it was hers alone. At first, the thought of living there without him had been almost unbearable, but now it felt like the beginning of something new. Sarah walked through the front door, the familiar scent of the house greeting her like an old friend. She paused for a moment in the entryway, taking it all in. The silence that once felt so lonely now felt comforting. She had spent so much time waiting for someone else to return, but in that moment, she realized that she had returned to herself. She didn't need to wait anymore. She was ready to begin the next chapter of her life. For the first time in a long while, Sarah allowed herself to really breathe. She went into the kitchen and started to make herself a cup of tea, something she hadn't done in what felt like forever. As she waited for the kettle to boil, she thought back to the moments when she had believed with all her heart that Mark would come back. She had lived in a space of constant hope, holding on to the idea of a future that seemed just out of reach. But now she saw things differently. Hope was not just about waiting for someone or something to change. It was about taking control of her own life and creating her own future. She made her tea and took it outside to the porch, where she sat down with a deep sigh of relief. The air was cool and the sky was starting to change color as the sun began to set. She didn't know why, but for the first time she felt at peace with everything. There was a kind of closure in the air, a sense that the past had given her all it could and now it was time for her to move forward. The next few days were spent in quiet reflection. Sarah didn't rush into anything. She didn't feel the need to make grand changes or leap into something new right away. Instead, she spent time in the garden, planting flowers and herbs, something she had always enjoyed doing. The simple act of tending to the earth felt grounding, and it helped her reconnect with herself. Each time she planted a seed, she felt like she was planting a part of her own growth, a reminder that life always moved forward no matter what had come before. One afternoon, as she worked in the garden, there was a knock at the door. Sarah wiped her hands on her apron and walked inside, wondering who it could be. When she opened the door, she was surprised to see Mrs. Jenkins standing there with a basket of fresh vegetables in her hands. "I thought you might like some of these," Mrs. Jenkins said with a warm smile. "I noticed you've been working hard in the garden. These should help your crops grow." Sarah smiled back, touched by the gesture. "Thank you, Mrs. Jenkins. That's really kind of you." Mrs. Jenkins nodded, her eyes sparkling with wisdom. "You're welcome. You know, sometimes when life feels hard, we forget that we're not alone. People are here, whether we see them or not. But the most important thing is to remember that you're the one in charge of your own life. Nobody else can give you the peace you're looking for. You have to find it inside yourself." The words struck Sarah deeply. She had spent so much time looking for peace outside herself, waiting for Mark to come back, hoping that something outside of her would change. But Mrs. Jenkins was right. The peace Sarah was looking for had always been within her. It was something she could create, something she could nurture, just like the flowers in her garden. The following weeks were filled with small, quiet moments that helped Sarah heal. She spent time with friends she hadn't seen in a while, rediscovered hobbies she had forgotten about, and began to reconnect with her community. She also started writing again, something she hadn't done since Mark had left. Writing had always been an outlet for her emotions, a way to express herself when words failed her. Through her writing, Sarah began to understand her own story better. She wrote about the pain of waiting, the longing she had felt, and the journey she had been on. She wrote about Mark, too, not with bitterness, but with the acceptance that he was part of her past, and that part of her would always carry him. But she also wrote about the new path she was forging, the strength she was discovering within herself, and the quiet hope that filled her heart for the future. One day, after spending the morning writing in the local coffee shop, Sarah decided to visit the bus station one last time. She didn't know why, but something inside her told her that it was time to say goodbye to that part of her life. As she walked down the familiar path to the station, she realized that it wasn't the same anymore. The station no longer held the weight of her waiting, the emptiness she had once felt when she stared at the road, hoping for Mark to return. Instead, it felt like a symbol of the past, a place that had once been filled with longing but was now just a place in her memories. When Sarah arrived at the station, she stood there for a moment, taking it all in. She remembered the days she had spent there, the hours of waiting, the hope that had kept her going. But now she realized she didn't need to wait anymore. The future was hers to create, and it was up to her to take the first step. As she turned to leave the station, Sarah felt a sense of freedom she had never known before. She wasn't running away from anything. She wasn't abandoning anyone. She was simply moving forward, embracing the possibility of something new. That evening, Sarah sat on her porch, the stars beginning to twinkle in the sky above her. She had let go of the past, and while she would always carry the love she had for Mark with her, she was ready to live for herself now. The road ahead was uncertain, but for the first time in a long time, Sarah felt ready to face it with hope, strength, and the quiet confidence that whatever came next, she would be okay.